much, Heather, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our law school webinar. This is the third webinar that we have given in the law school this semester, and welcome to it. I'm delighted to have my colleague, Dr. Sarah Christie, join us this afternoon. Sarah is an academic strategic lead in the law school, and whose research interests fall, I think she can correct me if I'm wrong, which I might be, and I don't think I am, fall within the area of a broad area of medical ethics and criminal law. And a specific aspect of that is the subject of our webinar tonight, which is assisted dying. So thank you, Sarah, for coming. I think now we'll just start questions, and as it's happened in the past, I will ask Sarah some questions and perhaps chip in a little bit throughout. And as Heather just said at the end, the recording will be stopped, and we would welcome any questions that any of you had, and Sarah would hopefully be able to give you an answer to them. So I think a relatively easy, perhaps, and I don't know if this is in fact an easy question, is what exactly is assisted dying? Sarah.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me along to this, and hello, everyone. As you say, this is an area within my sort of broad research interests in medical law, medical ethics, and way back when I started, more focused in criminal law, and this is an area that sits in the middle of a sort of a Venn diagram between the three of those kind of issues. Before I try and do any sort of quasi definition of assisted dying, I thought it might be useful perhaps to put it in a little bit of context in terms of potentially the scale of the issue that we're talking about here. So I had a bit of a poke around in National Records for Scotland and the Office of National Statistics and some other sources, and pulled out some statistics on death and dying, and particularly like the leading causes of death and dying, as well as some of the figures from Dignitas, which is the Swiss clinic that provides assisted dying for individuals who are able and prepared to travel to Switzerland to access that. So I've deliberately excluded 2020 for perhaps fairly obvious reasons. That death figures during 2020 are massively skewed by COVID-19. So when we look at things like the deaths per year for 2019, the figures for England and Wales, for example, sit at 530,000 deaths across the course of that year, with the leading causes for that. For women from 50 to 80, the leading cause is cancer, and then over 80, the leading cause becomes dementia. For men, the leading cause 50 to 80 is heart disease, and then again, once you reach the other side of 80, it becomes dementia. But when you look at deaths aggregated across the whole of the UK, 28% of those deaths in 2019 were caused by cancer. So it gives you a kind of a picture of the scale of the incidence of death on an annual basis. When we look at assisted dying, as it currently stands across both jurisdictions in the UK, assisted dying is not permitted. So when we look at something like the Dignitas clinic statistics, it gives an indication of the numbers of people who are in a position to be able to and prepared to take the step to go and travel to access assisted dying, such as it is available to them. And Dignitas's figures, again for 2019, show that 42 UK residents travelled over to Switzerland to access assisted dying there. And that represented 42 out of the 256 assisted deaths that the Dignitas clinic, administered in that particular year. Again, just to give a little bit of a sense of the wider scale, the Dignitas clinic opened its doors in 1998. So between 1998 and 2020, 478 UK residents have gone over to Dignitas. And just perhaps to take it out of the sort of the British and European kind of context, if we go over to Oregon, which is the home of the first piece of assisted dying legislation that was passed in 1997, again in 2019, there were 188 assisted deaths. Of those people, the average age was 74. 68% of them had cancer and 90% of them were in hospice end-of-life type care at the time when they accessed the assisted dying provisions there. But all of those statistics kind of sit alongside a real focus and drive that you see across quite a number of governments, quite a number of jurisdictions, to try to promote a more open and a more robust conversation about death and dying amongst us as a population of those countries. So when you look, for example, at the Scottish Government's strategic framework for action on palliative and end-of-life care, there is a specific call in there for a widespread, open, frank, robust discussion about death, about dying, about why and how it matters to people, and about how we as a society can discuss those issues more openly. So if we then turn to try and think about what assisted dying actually is, how you might define assisted dying, the precise phrasing varies reasonably significantly across different jurisdictions, different pieces of legislation. But if I try and distill it into a very broadly generalized kind of definition, it's the process by which someone who is suffering from intolerable pain and suffering as a result of an irreversible condition and wants to bring their life to an end now can, if they choose to do so, access assistance in securing the means to bring their life to an end. And as I say, legislation across different jurisdictions sets out a whole raft of different requirements. To go through any of them in detail, we would have to do multiple separate webinars because they are lengthy pieces of legislation in many cases with many, many safeguards built in, as you might expect. But if I draw some very broad generalizations from these various statutes, the kinds of things that you find are the incidence of an incurable illness, that the individual's in intolerable pain and suffering, that death is expected within a certain kind of time frame, or potentially that death is reasonably foreseeable, that individuals have to be over 18, that they have to have legal capacity, that they must make their request voluntarily, often multiple times, often both verbally and in writing as well, that their request has to be witnessed, that 2 independent medical practitioners have to verify that they meet the various criteria. And then the doctor will provide the assistance. The type of assistance, again, varies across jurisdictions. Sometimes it is no more than the writing of a prescription. Everything else is left to the individual. In some countries, the assistance involves administration of whatever the fatal medication actually is, rather than simply the writing of the prescription for it. Many jurisdictions have explicit requirements that the individual is made fully aware of all the palliative end-of-life care options that are also available, as well as the provisions on assisted dying. Some countries tie it to proof of residency or the fact that you qualify for state-funded healthcare in that particular country to discourage what is sometimes termed death tourism. Some countries don't. For example, if we circle back to Switzerland, obviously Switzerland has no residency requirement, so individuals can travel to Switzerland in order to access assisted dying there, rather than having to be a resident with proof of residency in that particular jurisdiction. So I have generalized wildly there in terms of pulling in things that tend to come up across the majority of these legislative regimes, but you can see the sort of picture of the type of situation the individual has to be in, and then the broad types of safeguards and requirements that are put in place before assisted dying can be actioned.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. They're fascinating. I just making some notes myself about this, and getting back to your contextual points. I mean, very illuminating on just the scale of death, and then I guess in light of the overall scale, 530,000 deaths in England and Wales in 2019, I think it was. And indeed zero, I guess 0% of assisted deaths within that jurisdiction, because it's
Yes.
unlawful, right? Obviously, but even in compared to those, or in light of those going abroad, to Switzerland in any event, just minuscule percentage of deaths compared to the leading cause of deaths. And so I just want to just sort of, I guess, reiterate what you said, the point you made. You said I found it interesting and illuminating. And the second one is just maybe the broader issue about the taboo nature of death and dying, that it seems to be one, even in these modern days where many subjects now that were hitherto something not spoken about can be, whether, sexuality or all sorts of other religion and all the other subjects that perhaps wouldn't be the subject of widespread debate and openness. And that's why I guess just in light, we don't want to talk about the current situation, but I'm interested in, excess deaths or deaths and, deaths within 28 days of a test or something. All of these, statistics were really something I didn't, I guess maybe because it was on the news every day and often that's not. I mean, I guess occasionally you hear about the leading cause of death being, for men being heart disease or, heart cancer, or men consequences of obesity or whatever, these sort of public health in a big sense things, but not in particular about death or dying. And I think that's different in or specifically a Western culture thing, where other cultures view it differently, I would have thought. I think, and maybe we'll come to that. Sorry, now and you can maybe bring that into about other jurisdictions just now. I mean, you alluded to it about the different positions and legislation in Oregon, in the U.S., and in Switzerland. And I know I have been aware of a debate within Scotland in recent years. I mean, I wonder if you could just tell everybody the current position across various jurisdictions, including Scotland.
Absolutely. So the position that we're in at the moment, I think I said earlier on when I mentioned Oregon that they are the starting point for this. So 1997, Oregon passed the Death with Dignity Act. And in US terms, since then, there's been a gradual creep across some of the country. And indeed, that would reflect the position globally. I think that there is a gradual spreading of assisted dying legislation across different jurisdictions, but it is by absolutely no means anywhere near universal as yet. So we have Oregon. There's then a number of other US states that have brought in their own provisions since then, by no means anywhere near the full totality of the states in the US. In European terms, the Netherlands have it, so does Luxembourg, Belgium, Switzerland, obviously. Germany as well. In fact, the Dignitas Clinic has a German clinic as well as a Swiss clinic. And actually, when you look at the statistics from Dignitas about the number of residents from different countries accessing their services for assisted dying, Germany represents quite a noticeably higher number than some of the other European countries. But I do wonder whether that's reflective of the fact that there is a clinic there and therefore it's perhaps more widely known, or just whether bluntly it's just easier and more accessible when it's within your own country rather than involving travel to a different country. Colombia has it. A couple of the Australian states have it. Canada now has it. New Zealand and Austria have both got to a position where it exists, but it's not yet in force. So they're going to come on stream very soon. There is a bill currently before one of the two houses in the Republic of Ireland, but so far as we're concerned, both jurisdictions, north and the south of the border, as yet we have nothing. There have been multiple attempts. There've been multiple attempts before the Scottish Parliament, and there's quite a lengthy history of repeated attempts at Westminster, but none of those have as yet come to anything. And one of the things that I think is also quite interesting when we think about the position across these different countries is how this legislation came into being. What sort of initially sparked the drive towards it. And there are two sort of broad camps here. There are those countries where an existing ban on assisted dying is challenged through the courts. So you have something like Carter against Canada, where the blanket ban on assisted suicide is struck down as being unconstitutional. And I'm about to wade out of my depth if I go much further into Canadian constitutional law, because that's certainly well outside my area of expertise. But you see that kind of approach in a couple of jurisdictions. So you have a court decision that's handed down that says effectively to the government, this blanket ban that you have on the provision of assisted dying is unlawful, unconstitutional. Therefore, you must legislate to bring that into line. The other way that it sometimes comes about, and indeed this was how it came about in Oregon way back at the start, is effectively through the ballot box. So the most recent example, New Zealand, what they did, lengthy history of debate, as most jurisdictions have, over the pros and cons of assisted dying, going to and fro. But they had a bill come before Parliament. It was debated vociferously. It was quite a long and drawn out process. And in the end, what they decided to do was to pass the bill, but suspend it coming into force until they'd had their general election. And then in the general election, a question was tagged on to the end of that. That makes it sound like it was done very dismissively. I'm sure it wasn't, but it was appended, perhaps, to the end of the ballot paper, so that as well as going and voting for whatever party you were wanting to vote for, you also had the opportunity to do a fairly straightforward yes/no vote on bringing in legislation to allow for assisted dying. And they'd had quite an extensive sort of campaign, information campaign in the run-up to the general election, alongside the general election campaigning, to raise awareness of what this bill was, what it meant, what the issues with assisted dying were, the two sides of the debate. And essentially, the position was left such that if the result of this ballot on the end of the general election ballot papers was that a majority of New Zealanders were in favour of assisted dying, then that legislation would be triggered into effect. Whereas when we look at the position, say in England, where there've been most assisted dying cases, we've seen things like Diane Pretty's case, Debbie Purdy's case. You know, we've had numerous ones since, Tony Nicholson and the Newby case, and you know, there've been quite a number of them over a steady period of time. You know, roughly speaking, every couple of years you're looking at another case which is quite a high-profile case. And yet consistently the courts often recourse to the argument, and I suppose a fairly well-worn argument, that there are some areas where it is for Parliament to change the law and not for the courts to get involved in attempting to do so. But when it's batted onto Parliament, neither Westminster nor Holyrood as yet seem to be convinced to push forward with legislation.
Yeah, and I guess in Diane Pretty's case, which I'm aware about, and I'm sure there's, well, perhaps there's other ones that have made it all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. I guess similarly, what are they deferential to the parties to the convention and not about to dictate to all 47 members of the Council of Europe that, you know, for example, I think what she argued, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the right to life includes the right to die, and she was seeking a guarantee to her husband, if I remember correctly, that he wouldn't be prosecuted for assisting her suicide, which is a criminal offense in England. And she was unsuccessful in an attempt to get that, you know, to force the DPP, I think, to guarantee that. And so the European Court of Human Rights hasn't been, so far as I understand, relevant in that debate. Okay, well, thank you. Very interesting. I wonder if there's, is there, when you're just describing all those countries, I mean, parallels or similarities between the parties who have acted to legislate, like more secular, I know, or is that the word, or more irreligious countries, and maybe not Ireland or Spain, or African or South American countries where churches play a greater role in society, perhaps, or a development? Are these more developed or richer, and maybe they have the time and the inclination, where other developing countries are too busy, with other imperatives. But as a thought that just came into my mind. Anyways, I think we better move on. So where these countries have legislated, I mean, I wonder what is the purpose? Is it to prevent criminalization of people, or to facilitate further? What I mean, I'm not sure in my mind why would states pass this legislation? What is its purpose?
Mm-hmm. So I think the goal tends to be the avoidance of pain and suffering when someone is in a situation where that pain and suffering is intolerable to them. Promotion of self-determination, the individual's right to autonomy, to be self-governing, to make their own decisions, and the need to preserve the dignity of the individual. Those tend to be, when you look at what has won the day in terms of arguments that have pushed forward the passage of legislation in these countries, it tends to coalesce around those three issues, which, when we think about it from an ethical perspective, which I think is at least nominally the title of this webinar, although you can't keep law and ethics divided on this particular issue, what we're looking at there is the principle of autonomy and the principle of non-maleficence, and the sanctity of life. Those are the three key things that are engaged. And indeed, when you look at Oregon's statistics, so they produce an annual report, numbers, splits by age, splits by gender, and so on. But one of the things that they also report are people's most cited reasons for taking up assisted dying. And the most cited reasons are a loss of autonomy, a loss of dignity, and a loss of ability to do the things that make their life enjoyable to them. Are the three biggest things that are referenced as the reason why people take up this option. And it engages very powerful ethical arguments. I mean, the principle of autonomy is a hugely significant ethical principle. So that ability as a competent adult, and that obviously imposes some limitations on it, but the ability as a competent adult to be self-governing, to determine what happens to you and exercise control over yourself, is hugely important here. And so your proponents of assisted dying, who are relying on the principle of autonomy, are talking about that need to be able to exercise control over your life, and that control over your life also means control over the extent of your life as well. I think we could probably do a whole other session on the difference between a right to die with a capital R and a right to die with a lowercase r, and the distinction between those, because you're quite right when you alluded to Article 2 and the right to life. The European Court are consistently clear that the right to life does not mean that there is also a concomitant right to death built into Article 2. And the principle of sanctity of life, again, is a hugely significant one, and is diametrically opposed to the principle of autonomy here. Your human life, under the principle of the sanctity of life, all human life is sacred and deserving and needing protection, and any act that deliberately shortens that life simply can't be allowed. And those two extremes provide us with the two polarized camps, if you like, on this issue. Is it about choice, freedom, self-control, being your own decision maker, being in charge of what happens to you? Or is it about the fact that you are human, and therefore in yourself you are special, your life is sacred, it is not for anyone to determine in any sort of artificial way the extent and the length of the life that you have.
I wonder, if I could just interject for a second. I wonder, even between, I don't know if this is what you're coming to next, but between those two poles, does the quality of life come into, where does that fit between, autonomy, like it may be an objective view of one's quality of life, and or I don't know how one judges a quality of life. I think of the case of Tony Bland. Wasn't he injured in the Hillsborough disaster,
Yeah.
and was in a permanent vegetative state, I think. Correct me
Yeah.
if I'm wrong. And so one could, and I thought the doctors had decided, and maybe I don't know if he was stem dead or not. I'm sorry, I don't know about that. I may be wrong. But it comes to point, some individuals in a situation like that objectively had a very little or maybe very, very low quality of life. They're not conscious at all or something. How does that fit in? Does that fit into the spectrum between autonomy and the sanctity of life?
Absolutely, because for someone who is relying on the autonomous rights of the individual to determine their own life in all its aspects, then that person is looking towards a subjective measure of the quality of life, and therefore recognizing that for that autonomous individual, their life may come to a point where for them it is one marked only by intolerable pain and suffering. And that's a subjective assessment, that your assessment or my assessment of what it might be like to live with a particular disease is completely irrelevant to that, because the autonomous individual is their own decision maker. And if for them it is intolerable, and that's why this idea of intolerable pain and suffering is built into the legislative frameworks that exist, because it's a means of being able to say that if you personally have got to a point where your life and the quality that you get from your particular life is now so marred by intolerable pain and suffering that you no longer want to continue with it, that you have the option, and it is of course only an option against other possibilities, but you have the option at that point to be able to access assistance in bringing that life to an end. On the other hand, when you think about it from the point of view of the sanctity of life, quality doesn't really come into it. If my life is sacred, my life is sacred. Any quality measure is not really the issue any longer. So it is a question of fundamental importance, and it is one that figures differently across these two diametrically opposed opposites.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I guess those two at the poles are irreconcilable, I suppose. When
Yes.
there's not going to be an accommodation between individuals who are firmly in one camp or the other. I wonder if you can move on to more practical. I think it's still related to some of these ethical issues, but I know Canada has been recently involved in and I've been reading some of my home country's newspapers about the developments in Canada and the existing laws and amendments and the debate in the Canadian Parliament. I wonder if you could just ever so briefly tell us a little bit about those and how have these ethical discussions been addressed in the Canadian context.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things in the Canadian debate here is that they've passed a number of amendments very recently, which really highlight some of the major ethical concerns that are put forward against the idea of legislating for assisted dying. So just to put it very briefly, without getting us entirely bogged down in legislation and subsections and such like, there are a couple of things that they have done which have extended the number of people who would meet the eligibility criteria. So, for example, prior to these most recent amendments, one of the eligibility criteria was that you were in a state of intolerable pain and suffering where death was reasonably foreseeable. And there was a whole debate about what reasonably foreseeable means. As lawyers, we know perfectly well that's a phrase you can pick apart in a number of areas of law. And it posed difficulties of interpretation here. But it was a means of being able to put a kind of time frame on this, that the intent behind the original legislation, which you find replicated in other legislative frameworks as well, was that this was for people who couldn't stand the level of pain and suffering that they were living in as a result of the particular condition that they suffered from, and were also in a state where their death was something which was going to be happening within a reasonably short time frame. Some jurisdictions put figures on it, so your death expected to take place within less than 6 months, for example. Some of them phrase it rather more generically. So Canada originally had this idea of where death was reasonably foreseeable. What they've done in these most recent amendments is to extend that to include individuals who are in intolerable pain and suffering, but where death is not reasonably foreseeable, which caused quite a degree of controversy, to put it mildly, because that expands a category of individuals that would qualify here to those who are in intolerable chronic pain, but not as a result of a condition which is going to lead to their death within a specific or a generalized kind of time frame. The other thing that they've done, which expands the number of people who might be eligible for this, is to allow for advanced consent. So to explain it as briefly as I possibly can, all these legislative frameworks involve a whole series of steps that are designed to ensure that you genuinely, absolutely, really, irrevocably do want to take up assisted dying. So that there are multiple steps along the route where you make your request and you give your consent, and it's very explicit and upfront. There's no implied consent kicking around here at all. And the concern for some people was that because this process takes a little bit of time, they might start at a point where they had legal capacity and met all the other criteria, were in intolerable pain and suffering and everything else, but that they feared that they would actually lose legal capacity before they got to the stage where they could actually access the assistance in dying. And because there was a requirement for a final determinative consent from the individual right at the very end, that because they'd lost capacity, they wouldn't be able to give that. And so these amendments bring in provisions to allow for that individual in those kinds of circumstances to waive that final consent and to give, like, advanced consent. Now, there are a whole slew of additional procedural safeguards built in those kinds of cases, because it gives you two different types of person who's accessing assisted dying here. But without getting any further into the complexities of them, both of them raise the ethicist's friend of an argument, the slippery slope, because what both of them show is that Canada has started down a particular route and passed a piece of legislation, and then within a relatively short time frame beyond that has moved to making an amendment to push it a little bit further in this direction, and making another amendment to push it a little bit further in a different direction. And this is the fear that lies behind the argument of the slippery slope, that once you start on a course of action, it's very difficult to stop what you might call incremental creep. You know, that a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and then you suddenly realize that almost unconsciously, you've got yourself to a point where you are now a long way from where you started, and quite possibly a lot further than you ever meant to go from where you started. And so I find it interesting to look at these, and you can see the ethical controversies playing out here, because your Canada has served up an example for those who want to define it that way, of exactly that fear that the slippery slope starts, and once your feet lose traction, you can't stop, and who knows where you end up.
Yes, I guess the subject of examination in the future would be whether, if Canada indeed takes the next step, or indeed other countries who have gone, whether Oregon or jurisdictions, Switzerland, continue to, I don't know what the phrase would be. Would it be liberalize the rules? I don't know, or expand the rules. I don't know how you would describe that widening of or loosening of the restrictions and widening of the availability. That's fascinating. Another maybe slightly different aspect as well, a different question about maybe more practical sense. Okay, say a jurisdiction like Canada or Switzerland has legalized it. How does it work in practice? Like, what would how does it happen? You mentioned, a doctor might just prescribe things, or does it absolve individuals of criminal immunity? And maybe one thing, or is it more a dignitas? I don't know. I've heard about it. Do they go and get a lethal injection? I mean, I don't know. How does this work in practice?
So there are two broad types of assistance in dying, and if I borrow a sort of an American vernacular for it at the minute, when you look at the literature in America, there's a lot of discussion of this idea of physician-assisted, physician-assisted dying. And that is contrasted with the idea of physician-administered dying. So what Canada has is physician-administered. So the medical practitioners involved will be involved in administering whatever it is that's going to bring about this person's death. Whereas where you have legislative regimes that focus on physician assistance, the physician is further divorced from it. So Oregon, when they started out, and still to date, have physician-assisted dying. So in Oregon, the assistance that you get is that your doctor writes you a prescription for tablets of some concoction that will kill you, and do so in a managed and painless kind of a way. And the premise there is that it's putting a very clear, bright line between the doctor and the death, which is seen by many to be a really fundamental ethical requirement, that our iconography of a doctor is the white coat or the green scrubs with the stethoscope sort of, attractively draped around the neck. You can tell that I spent too much of my young adulthood watching episodes of ER, but that vision of a doctor. And what we don't want to do is to start to confuse that iconography of a doctor with something that looks a bit more like the Grim Reaper, with the death sickle and what have you. And I'm getting a little bit flowery here, but there's a very clear and a very understandable ethical concern on the part of many that the role of the doctor is not something that should bleed across into becoming someone who brings about your death. We think of doctors as being there to care for us. They bring us into the world. They help us get over the coughs and sneezes and the COVID-19s and the heart attacks and whatever else it is that happens to us through the course of our life. But we don't really feel so comfortable with the idea of seeing them as helping us, avoiding harm and pain and suffering, but doing it by bringing about our deaths. And so you have this very clear distinction between probably the majority of legislative regimes that simply allow for physician assistance for that writing of the prescription. It then puts the onus on the individual to decide when and where to take their medication, or indeed whether to take it at all, because of course it's quite possible in Oregon, for example, that you go through all the process having decided that you want to bring your life to an end, meeting all the criteria, going through all the procedural safeguards. You go to the doctor and you get the prescription, you go home with it and you never cash in the prescription. Or you then go to the pharmacy, you cash in the prescription, you come home with a bottle of tablets and you never take them, and you die 6-9 months later of natural causes, and that fatal prescription is still on the proverbial nightstand. Or you might go home and take it straight away. But the point is that the decision is yours. Mm-hmm. One of the problems that's perceived with that is that it limits it to those people who are physically capable of taking the medication themselves.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking happened in the case of Diane Pretty. She was worried that she would get to a stage where she would be unable to commit suicide herself because she was just so physically disabled. She couldn't do it. So in that case, maybe it was swallowing tablets that her husband would have to assist her. Is this what you're alluding to? The husband, yes, say, or the partner or somebody would help the individual
or
take
even the doctor. It's a completely different step. To write a prescription for someone, or as a pharmacist to fill a bottle in accordance with the prescription instructions, is quite a different act than to put the tablets in someone's mouth and hold the glass for them while they drink because they're not capable of doing it themselves, or injecting someone. But one of the reasons why some legislative frameworks go to the stage of a physician administered is that if you limit it to physician assisted, it poses a real ethical dilemma, because someone who knows that they have a particular condition which is incurable, which is going to kill them in X amount of time, and which will lead to a gradual degeneration of their physical ability. If all that you have access to is physician-assisted dying, and therefore a prescription which you have to take yourself, the problem is that that person who has made that decision may well wish to live through longer, or live further through the progression of their disease before they come to a point where they're in intolerable pain and suffering. But they can't afford to wait that long, because they know they're going to have to be able to take the medication themselves, and therefore they're in a position where they feel compelled to request assisted dying earlier than they actually wanted, which raises a whole raft of ethical difficulties, because you're then in a position where someone is, often the concern with coercion is that people are coerced into accepting assisted dying because they feel like they're a burden on the state, burden on family. They should just take it and cease to be a problem for anyone. But actually, there can also be other elements of coercion that if you bring in certain types of regime, the person who is going to benefit from that is actually themselves compelled to take the step to bring their life to an end earlier than they want to, because of the limitations on what the law will allow. So in some ways, you're by doing a thing to resolve one problem, you end up creating actually another different but equally difficult ethical issue.
Yes, we're sort of obliging, or arguably obliging a doctor to assist as opposed to just facilitate the death. I wonder where those jurisdictions where the doctor does provide assistance, are there limits to how or when a doctor would do that?
I'm not quite sure what
when the doctor is providing assistance. You say there's doctor, we had administered. Maybe I get this clear in my mind. There's a physician administered. So in that case, the doctor would I don't know, give an injection him or herself. Is that right?
That could be, yeah.
And then okay, I'm getting in my own mind. And then assisted, they would hand over. Okay, I see. Assisted, they would, as you've just been saying, would say hand over a prescription. Okay, no, that's clear. Sorry, I was just confused in my own mind. I think we're just about maybe come to our last question, if that's okay, Sarah. Mm-hmm. I know there has been I forget her name, an MSP who for years, Margaret MacDonald had advocated this introduction of this in the Scottish context. And then recently, I think it's been in the news, even leading up to the upcoming election in May again, about another news story about this. I wonder if you could provide me and our audience with an update, if that's okay, on what the position is in Scotland presently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as it stands at the moment, Margot MacDonald brought forward a number of attempts at passing this type of legislation, all of which consummately failed. The position that we're in at the moment is that there, or at least rumour has it, that there is going to be a bill put before the new Scottish Parliament once it convenes after the general election. And there seems to be a growing opinion that there perhaps is the parliamentary will to pass this time, perhaps depending on how many new MSPs are elected who are of a more liberal kind of mindset, that might be the opportunity that actually tips the balance in favor of passing legislation. And there's consistent evidence from things like YouGov polling data and what have you, that public opinion has, broadly speaking, shifted to being in favor of assisted dying, and has been in that position for a little while now. What I suppose has also happened as well alongside that is a shift in stance by the BMA and the Royal Colleges to perhaps a majority of members being either in favour of assisted dying legislation or at least neutral about it, and a minority of people, of members being opposed to it, which I guess gives you an inkling that the profession, the medical profession, has also perhaps started to move in a direction that would be more favourable to the passing of legislation. But that's the unresolved question at the minute. Is there the political momentum to see this over the finish line and have a piece of legislation passed or not? And that's the $1 million question at the minute.
Yeah. So I can't put you on the spot and say, if you were to be a crystal ball gazer, would you think maybe, and maybe not in like June or July or in the autumn of 2021, but do you think in a more general sense, is this the direction of travel, and all these other jurisdictions you mentioned earlier, that ultimately you think Scotland will legislate in some shape or form in this area, do you think? Or is it possible that no, for whatever reason, such a development just won't happen?
If I had to crystal ball gaze, I think it has more of a chance than it's ever had of being passed. I could maybe go that far. It really is going to depend on the constituent makeup of the new Holyrood Parliament, and because what you tend to find in this issue and other contentious issues, I mean, abortion comes to mind as the obvious one, is that you don't tend to find so many people who sit in a kind of neutral ground. People do tend to polarize one side or the other. And the question is whether you've got that tipping point or not. There is quite a lot of chatter suggesting that maybe that tipping point might have been reached. And that chatter may be coming from people who are quietly relatively informed about the likely progression of it as we go into a new parliament. And I think certainly if it doesn't get through this time, I mean, proponents of it are not going to let it rest. It will come back again, and for every time that it comes back again, I think you're seeing incrementally more and more progress towards that point where you get to the majority decision and the legislation can be passed. So I suspect it's coming. Whether it comes in this immediate next attempt or not, I'm less sure about, but I suspect it is probably coming.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot like that.
No, that's quite all right.
And thank you. I guess that I can't believe this hour is gone so very, very quickly. So I'm just going to say thank you right now, and we're sort of done this sort of part of our webinar, and I'm much appreciated and very informative and fascinating. So thank you, Sarah.